All right. 4 minutes after. Hello. Got to ban someone. That was cool. Bot sending an ad. Let's kill the music. Transition over here. Hello. Hello. Everybody. All right. Sorry, just getting stuff set up as we go. We're gonna. Let's hide that for now. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Let's see. There we go. 5 minutes, still pretty good. Alrighty then. Yeah. So, why is my hold on? You think you have these things set? No, it's not too bad. We'll do it okay. Okay, cool. Thank you for hanging out as we test things. Excellent. So, welcome to Sunday morning papers, which is actually in the morning today. So that's a move in a positive direction. I wanted to pull up. Hold on. I should have had this set up already, but I am not good at things. Okay, there we go. Let's open this guy. Oh, that's gonna bother me. I'm gonna have to fix that. And now let's go ahead and share this. Sorry, this will be visible in a second. I promise. There we go. Okay. So this is the schedule, which has a horrible, awful, very bad, no good error on it, in that the Sunday bar is not lined up with the Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday bar, and is driving me nuts. So I'm gonna have to fix that. But anyway, this is how we're gonna set up weekly schedules and something along this lines. This should be fairly standard for a schedule. Yeah, so this should be fairly standard for the schedule I'm aiming for. About 3 streams a week. Each stream being about hour to 2, between 1 and 2 hours. I'm not a incredibly proficient streamer, but that's fine. So yeah, look for a couple hours. Also, I'm gonna say this is not necessarily set in stone, in that I might throw in some other streams if I want to do some other gaming. And these might shift depending on, other requirements I have, but just to kind of go through this. So this is for this week. Obviously today we have Sunday morning paper. It is 10:39 EST. So that's what we're starting with. No planned stream for tomorrow. Tuesday, we will go for The Hobbit Chapter 4, reading that. Typically, Tuesday will be... So Sunday is obviously going to be Sunday morning papers. Tuesday will be usually reserved for either gaming or reading or something not mathy, physicsy related. Nothing on Wednesday. Thursday morning... Oh, yeah. So I want to highlight the times. Tuesday is 5:30 EST is the scheduled time for stream. Thursday at 11 EST is going to be the research stream. What is the research stream? So this is going to be a single project that's going to be a multi-stream project that might be a legitimate research topic. We are going to be doing, this is kind of related to some of the stuff for those of you who have bounced in and out of the stream before, have seen what we've been doing with the Kohane functions and the time frequency spaces, like ambiguity functions, like Wigner distributions, these kinds of things. If you've seen them, some of my past streams, those names might ring a bell for you. If not, we're going to be going down that route. I'm going to be, so this Thursday morning, 11, we'll be starting with a review. So we'll go back through some key highlights from a couple of papers about the Wigner function and or the Wigner distribution, which is kind of where we want to end up. And then we're going to hop into a deep dive on path integrals. So path integrals are like what you can see on my desk there. They're somewhat complex. They were originally applied to quantum mechanics by Feynman, but we're going to try applying them to something different, and we're going to see what happens. Now, in the past, it has been applied to Wigner spaces, and then so we're going to practice that, and then we're going to take advantage of the Wigner space ambiguity function relationship to see what happens, right? I don't know the answer to this. I haven't been able to find any. Why are you settings open? Anyway, I haven't been able to find any information on someone doing this specifically, but so that's why it's going to be a research stream. It's going to be pretty math heavy. It will be a multi-stream. It's going to start with some review, and then we're going to go on from there. And then Friday, Saturday, no planned streams. So that is going to be kind of the default schedule for this. In later schedules, as this gets more well organized, hopefully I will have more specifics for each day, what we're going to do for that day. And as I said, this might shift as other people get interested, or their ideas get pushed forwards, or just things strike our interest, if you will. So anyway, that's the basic idea. This is the setup that we're gonna aim for, and we're gonna try it out this week and see how it goes, and see if we need to make modifications. The name of the game is flexibility, and we'll kind of play it that way, but we'll try and keep this as something of a baseline and see what happens. Okie dokie. Let's put it away. All right. So, transition. Oh, they keep. I wonder if it's this setting. Duplicate sources. Ooh, does that work? Sorry. All right. Cool. Duplicate the sources. Interesting. Oh, that's annoying. Anyway, OBS keeps getting changes, and it reset a bunch of my settings I had set up. Updates are fun. Okay. Anyway, so today I figured, since some people might show up that aren't maybe don't have an extensive math background, looking for stuff that might be a little easier on the eyes, easier to join in on without a background. We're gonna do a philosophy paper that was actually read at the Metaphysical Society of America's meeting in 2025, at the beginning of 2025, by Lawrence Calhoun, who's a wonderful individual that I know decently well, and is a very engaging writer. So we will be doing a philosophy paper this time, but it'll have ties into math and science. And we'll talk through some of those ideas as we get to them. I will note, and I want to put this out there, that this is a draft paper, right, that he gave at a talk. This is not final. I have draft scribbled all over this paper. So take it for what it is. This is not a final paper. He might have published the final paper. I'm not sure if he did. But I have this draft from his talk. Because it's a talk, it's not excessively long. And so we should be able to make our way through it without too much angst. Anyway, so let's go ahead and show the paper. Okay, so this is going to be a lot more reading than typical for these, because there's a lot less math to crank through and a lot more reading and ideas to kind of discuss. If anything strikes your fancy, if you feel that I've said something that doesn't make sense, if you have a question about any of the subjects, I will do my best to answer. I will note I do philosophy by interest as opposed to as a job. So I do not have a degree in philosophy. I do know some, and I will try to highlight what I know. If I say something amiss, please feel free to correct me. Or if you have any questions, you'd like anything discussed more. The nice thing about these sorts of papers is they can spark discussion. So if there's something that sparks your interest, feel free to pipe up. If you don't think of it now, you think of it later, you can hop on our Discord that's up at the top of the screen. Feel free to join there. And write a couple of essays about how wrong I am over there. Yes. So that being said, I believe that's all the introductory info that we have for today. And today I think we're going to use a highlighter. Oh, yes. Very excellent. Let's see, what do we need? It's about right. Ooh. I was going to find all the shortcuts so I could set them up to the pen and make it so I could switch to all the things. Yeah. No, he's a really good writer. That's the other thing. He's very engaging. And he's also very engaging if you ever go to any of his talks. He's a very nice person, a very engaging person. But anyway, so let's read through this and discuss. Reality isn't everything, some say. It isn't what it used to be. Some dislike it. Cecil Connolly lamented, quote, "Everything is a dangerous drug except reality, which is unendurable." Elwood P. Dowd was more hopeful, reporting that after wrestling with reality for 35 years, he had finally, quote, "won out over it." How big is it? Woody Allen wrote, "The reality I speak of is the same as Hobbes described, but a little smaller." Some don't believe in it. Einstein claimed reality is an illusion, quote, "albeit a very persistent one." I'm curious what the context is on that. I haven't actually read Einstein. Einstein did a whole bunch of philosophical papers as well, in addition to obviously his physics ones. We should do that one time. I'll see if he has any more philosophically oriented papers. Because obviously he's more well known for like his EPR paper and his general relativity papers. But yeah, I'm curious. Anyway, yet our founder, Paul Weiss, so again, this was at the Metaphysical Society of America, which was founded in 1950, I believe, by Paul Weiss, made its study the sole purpose of our society, the MSA. Our stubborn president has seen fit to recall us to this ungainly topic. The many usages of the term, quote, real and reality cannot be correlated here, nor can we engage in a manifold analysis of cognate terms like being and existence. although they will make brief appearances. Philosophers have identified all sorts of things as, quote, the real, unquote, form, substances, God, materiality, mind, experience, the whole or the one, etc. They commonly differ on the reality of topics like time, universals, possibilities, and numbers. Some might make entities alone real, others forms. So there's Plato, and there's Aristotle. Laws, process, or properties. I don't know who laws would be. Process is probably Whitehead. Anyway, properties is also kind of semi-Aristotelian. Some thinkers do not humble themselves with the real per se, but claim that what everyone regards as real is constituted by human processes, making us the real source of what we take to be real. It's very Kantian. I'll suggest that the philosophical meaning of, quote, real and reality fall into 4 categories. I do not mean the reference of the term, so in other words, what the term is referring to, the thing that the term is a topic of. So in other words, the things that are real. I do not mean the reference of the terms. The items philosophers have claimed to be real. I do not mean the reference of the terms that items philosophers have claimed to be real. These are many, as noted. I mean the 4 meanings or senses of real which philosophers employ to pick out the population of reality. So in other words, what are the core ways in which people define categories, right? People like to categorize everything they run into. And so what are these 4 categories that people run into? Oh, hey, Popo. Long time no see. Brain, what was I doing? Right. So what are these the ways in which people develop categories by which they then apply to everything they run into and try to determine what real is. Okay, 2 of the 4 are common in everyday life. It is practically necessary to distinguish from the things of our everyday encounters the unreal, which may include dreams, hallucinations, delusions, or perceptual illusions, fictive objects, what is past or possible or ideal, not present, what is idiosyncratic to one or a few minds, imitations, or what is not, quote, authentic, and in general, whatever appears to be in some way, but is not. Good to see you again. Yeah, I'm hoping to be more consistent again with the streams. So I apologize, I sort of died off there for a while, but I have people who are threatening to hit me with heavy objects if I don't move forward. Yeah, so I'm making a spirited attempt to get back into the swing of things. I don't know if you're here for the schedule. I'll put the schedule up again at the end, and then I'll have the schedule going in the Discord. I'm gonna actually couldn't get into the Discord for a while. I finally lost the login to the Discord, got it back. So everything should be getting back into a regular sense of actually streaming and doing things in a more coherent way. So anyway, good to see you again. Right. Distractions aside, where were we? I will suggest, as in Lawrence Calhoun, will suggest that the philosophical meanings of real and reality fall into 4 categories. Oh, we saw that, right? Right. All these distinctions can be captured by some application of the 2 terms actuality and objectivity. So in other words, when we talk about something being real, right, we want to talk about it in terms of what this idea of things that aren't purely dependent on you as a subject engaging with it to be real, right? So if something is objective, other subjects can encounter the same thing and can have a subjective experience, an independent subjective experience of the object, right? So subjectivity is still part of this. So as an individual, right, you might experience a desk, say, because in front of me, right? You might experience a desk in a specific way. For example, it might recall back memories of things you've done there, or emotions, right? Maybe this was a desk that belonged to some member of your family, something like that. Someone else can come and also have their own subjective experience of the desk. So, for example, say your parent from whom you got the desk comes in and sees the desk again and remembers the things they did at the desk, the time they were in school, whatever. They're having their own subjective experience, but they're unified by this object that is exterior to the subject, to both subjects of you and your parent, discussing the desk. So the reality, right, of this thing of the object, or let me take that back. The object, the desk, is because it's able to impart subjective experiences in many people that can actually agree on certain elements of that subjective experience, like color, shape, that kind of thing, right? That means that there's something more real, in this sense of real, about the desk than just the subjective experience, right? It's not the desk as a hallucination. It's the desk as something that can impart subjective experience into multiple people in a consistent way, right? For people who have the powers to be able to experience that subjective experience. So a blind person wouldn't see the color of the desk, for example, right? So there's a requirement, like an underlying requirement there, but regardless, there's something that we can connect to now. Kant would say, because everything is filtered through our experience, we have no actual access to the thing in themselves besides knowing that there is something in itself, right? Everything else is subjective. Everything else is filtered through our experiences. But we can say that there's something, we just can't really access directly the thing itself. That has been argued back and forth for hundreds of years now, but regardless. Anyway. Right. The third and fourth senses are purely philosophical. One is general or ontological priority, the ultimate or foundational, is often applied to whatever beings are considered independent, others being dependent on them. Most metaphysical views seek ontological priority. In doing so, they commonly employ actuality and objectivity. Right, so in our discussion, they were talking about the desk. There's the idea that the desk itself, if it is something that multiple people can have subjective experiences, can have similar subjective experiences about, there's something more foundational, more real, if you will, about that object of the desk than about the subjective experience, because the subjective experience that I have is different from the subjective experience that you have, even though we can agree about certain things, right? But the fact that we can agree about certain things and point to the desk as the object of these subjective experiences means that we can have those subjective experiences without the object. Therefore, the object is more real or more foundational than the subjective experience, right? The fourth and last sense of reality that he's talking about is less well known and only recently named ontological parity, which he will define. The appearance of ontological parity in philosophical history is more clandestine than the others. Clandestine, that's one way to use that word. This paper is about that clandestine sense. I claim that ontological parity has problems which, ontological priority. So that idea that we talked about before about the desk being more real versus other things, has problems which this new idea, ontological parity, avoids. This does not mean ontological priority is entirely wrong, nor that ontological parity is entirely right. Both are in themselves inadequate. My argument will be that the ontological parity plays a crucial role in a metaphysical inquiry. We need it, however much we may then go beyond it. So this idea of ontological parity, whatever it is going to be an important baseline as we try and go forwards and think about what reality is in other cases. Right. Oh, sorry. I was just looking at something. Sweet. Outstanding. Sorry. Ooh, I can see all the things. All right, I need to stop clicking on things. Okay. The four senses of the real. Welcome to the desert of the real, to quote Morpheus in The Matrix. Anyway. We can begin with actuality. It is often connected to the temporal present. In everyday terms, it is what can be perceived or encountered or can enter into the causal relations presently. It often excludes what is past or possible, perhaps also ideals, things that are ideals or things that are fictional, like characters, right? I think this is a messier statement than it was intended. Putting so much emphasis on the past is a problem unless you take into account issues from relativistic mechanics and what the past means, right? I think putting stronger emphasis onto the possibility of causal relations is what gives you the past, present, and future. At least as it's defined in that case, right? So the distinction between past, present, and future is defined in terms of what can possibly influence you or what you can possibly influence at your moment in space-time based on your light cones. Let's draw a diagram. All right. So, in relativity, right? In relativity, rather than talking about space separately and time separately, right, you combine them into something called space-time, which is typically shown in this. Huh? Okay. Anyway, so that's shown typically like this, where you'll have time and space. Obviously, this is a one-dimensional representation of three-dimensional space, but that's besides the fact. And this is you, right? Actually, I should do it like this. Man, I've really got to figure out how to bind. We're gonna pretend these. We're gonna pretend these are at 90 degrees, right? So 90 degrees, 90 degrees. Okay, well, so what does this represent? This is your future. This is your past. These lines at 45 degrees out are the speed of light. Or rather, they have a slope of the speed of light, right? Because if you remember, obviously, speed is in meters per second, so it's space over time, right? So it's the slope of this is the derivative of this line in space and time, right? So this in general is called a light cone in relativity. Because of the restrictions on informational transport, or an influential transport as a result, the only things that can affect you are in this cone. The only things you can affect are in this cone, right? Things out here cannot affect you until time marches on, right? So say there's some event that happens over here, right? Time marches on and eventually it gets to here, and now say light that's emitted from this, say this is a supernova out in some other galaxy, right? Once you cross this line, light from that supernova has gotten here and you can see it, right? It can affect you in some way. Here, there's no causal connection, which results in something pretty weird. And that weird thing is that since everyone has their own light cone, right? Every point in space-time theoretically has its own light cone. If there's another observer that is moving with respect to you over here, what they agree on as the present is going to be different. So anything in here, you can't give a direct connection of past, present, future, because different observers will have different views of past, present, and future of an entity over here based on where they are with respect to this light cone. It might be in someone's future, it might be in someone else's past. And if you have you can have actually multiple events that occur. One observer might see event 1 and then event 2, and some other observer might see event 2 and then event 1. All these kinds of things can happen, and so the time ordering isn't universal, right? It's different for different observers depending on how they're moving with respect to these things. Once you cross light cones, however, things are fixed, right? Because then there's a potential causal connectivity there and things get fixed. So what that means is here on Earth, the distinction between people's light cones is very, very small because everything is very close together. Like if you're talking light speed travel, everything's very close together. So this doesn't really affect us on Earth. And so typically we think of time as being, we instinctively kind of think of time as being universal. That is not actually the case. So the this in my mind prioritizes causality over temporality in that sense. In that one's temporality is sort of adrift until something that can have an effect on you drifts into your light cone, and things outside of the light cone have no connection to you or anything that you would consider your temporal progression until they enter your light cone down here, right? Your past light cone. Anyway, that was very much a side rabbit hole. But it's an interesting when you start talking about this in terms of actuality. You start getting I think actuality has to be discussed slightly differently than this, because there's more than just the temporal and what can enter into the causal relations, because there is an actuality I guess what you'd have to say is whether it has the ability within the entire history of the universe to have any causal interactions, right? So can the light cones ever intersect with each other? And if there's no possibility of intersecting light cones, then you can have things that some third person considers real, but the two themselves are. It starts getting a little weird, right? So I think actually this is tying actuality with past and present in this sort of way can. I think you need to go a little bit into the relativistic mechanics to start really poking at what this actually means. But anyway, that tangent aside, let's continue. Okay. Some use presence or the term existence for the actual, which would be all right where existence is not conflated with being or beings. Beings must be broader than existence, since its opposite is just nothing. And likewise, being with a capital B. So in other words, being with a capital B is like the characteristic that all things share, if you want to think of it that way, right? Is that in the same way you could talk like, it's almost the Platonic concept, like talking about red as abstracted from any red object, right? You can try and talk about what is it that's shared by all beings that gives them the connection to being, which is a very roundabout way to try and talk about these things. So it's very difficult to nail down exactly what these are. Yeah, so that's what being with the capital B is talking about, right? Some philosophers privilege the actual, while others are at pains to give possibilities or ideals higher reality. That's Plato. He did that. At any rate, the actual versus non-actual distinction plays a role. But I hope that I'm sort of impressed that it, even within this discussion set, it's not as simple as it might be. It might at first look, right? Anyway, the second. So what were we? Sorry, I got so distracted. The second sense of the real. Okay, we're talking about senses of the quote real, right? The second sense that people talk of reality is objectivity. In everyday experience, it is crucial to distinguish perceptions and cognitions, so thoughts, particular to a particular set of agents or perspectives from what is more generally available. This is what I was talking about before with the desk, right? That's the objectivity idea. Philosophers conceive of objectivity and its putative opposite, subjectivity. In overlapping ways. Some take objectivity to mean things in themselves independent of the representational powers or perspective of minded agents. So in other words, what's objective is the thing of the desk that is able to cause subjective experience in subjects, right? So the thing that is able to provide an experience, which is different than the experience of the thing itself, right? Okay. So some take subjectivity to mean an individual agent's experiential process or perspective. But these are extremes of a continuum. Objective and subjective are a matter of degree. In other words, so okay, it's a little confusing how you said it. So some people will like separate these things all the way apart, right? So they'll take this as objectivity is completely independent of the mind of the individuals who encounter it, right? It is the thing that is independent of it, and subjectivity is just purely the experience of the subjective, of the subject, the person that encounters. So it's what the object imparts in the subject. That's everything that's subjective. Whether there's an objectivity to that concept, to that subjective experience, is an interesting question. Anyway, so he says, so some people put those at opposite ends of the scales. Some people will mix them up a little more. But yeah, so that's why he's saying objective and subjective are matters of degree. Objective refers to what is relatively inherent across, hence independent of, some set of minds, while subjective implies the inverse, what is relatively more dependent on some set of agents. Commonly, philosophers regard what is perceived or cognized, so thought, by human agents as agents generally as objective, even if dependent on their representational powers. So, in other words, philosophers will typically take thoughts or experiences to be in some way objective, right? Even though there's a difference between the experience of red and the wavelength of light that imparts that experience, which is why you can have colors that don't, quote, really exist, unquote. There are a number of colors that don't correlate to a specific spectrum of light. So how this works is your eye has 3 types of light sensing cells, right? So if we look at color, not color, I'm sorry. That is a really bad term. That's the worst term to use, in fact. So if we're looking at wavelength of light, and then we're looking at and this way is cell response, right? There are 3 main ones, which, if I remember, are something like this. This is very approximate. It's been a while since I've seen this. This and this, right? So actually I should change this. This is wavelength, this is frequency. So this is low frequency, this is high. Oops, shoot. What am I doing? Oh my god. I need to stop clicking on things. There we go. So yeah, this is frequency. This is lower frequency, like red, what we perceive as red. This is higher frequency, like what we perceive as blue, right? And the colors that you're perceiving are actually different, various responses of these 3 types of cells, right? So there's, for any individual color, there's some mix of these cells that's lighting off that your brain interprets as a specific color. But that means that you can play some games and mix some of these responses in ways that don't correlate to a specific color. So you can simultaneously spark a red and a blue, for example, right? So in place where these will have a high response, and your brain will smush that into a single color. It doesn't actually correlate to a specific frequency of light. Right. So that is why your experience of light, of color, is different from what might be called objective color in an independent frequency of light. So that's why there are, quote, imaginary or fake colors. They're not really fake. The experience of color is real, but the experience of color is different than light frequency. Anyway, what got us down that? What? Man, I don't even know what rabbit brought Alice down that rabbit hole. But anyway. Some philosophers claim reality is or arises out of subjectivity, right? In the sense of human experience, mind, action, or semiosis. Don't remember what semiosis means. Let me look that up. SEMIOSIS. Semiosis is any form. Okay. From the Greek, or sign process, any form of activity, conduct, or process that involves signs or the production of meaning. Okay. So, meaning, the idea of building the concept of meaning, right? But even they are typically interested in the intersubjective, not idiosyncratic personal experience, right? So in other words, things that can be agreed upon by multiple subjects, not things that are purely in the head of one subject that can never be shared or experienced with another. To the latter reality would be solipsism, which no one accepts. So solipsism is the idea essentially that you're a brain in a vat, you have no connection to anyone else or anything else. Everything is purely some form of hallucination, and yeah, there's no sense of reality outside of that. You can't say anything beyond the personal experience, and so there's no point in even trying. Lastly, objectivity is a sense of real that appears in epistemic realism, the notion that human judgment is valid when true of its objects as they obtain, independent of the judgment. At any rate, all of these cases, something's relative invariance across and independence of particular set of agents of agent perspective matters. So again, it's that independence of the individual that gives something the concept of objectivity. These two definitions of actuality or non-actuality and objectivity or subjectivity are employed in everyday experience as well as philosophy. They are not incompatible and often overlap, right? All of these things can be true or can be used. Metaphysics usually presumes a third notion. Something or some kind of thing is prior to all else, prior in a non-relative way. This could be called ontological priority. Priority can be temporal, mereological, causal, logical, or validative. That is, it can mean the priority of the origin of things or the simplest components, right? So in the idea that atoms are prior to molecules, right? You can't have a molecule is composed of atoms, therefore atoms are in some way foundational to molecules, right? Molecules can't exist without the atoms that make it up. Okay, where are we? There's priority, right? Simplest components or processes of things, or the kinds which cause all others. So, so the chair maker is prior to the chair, right? The chair doesn't exist without the chair maker because the chair maker caused the chair to happen, or is logically presumed by all other concepts, or the whole process which embraces all things, or the most important, or the best of things. In most cases, the prior is that which is independent of everything else, and all else is dependent on it. So usually in philosophy, in metaphysics a lot, you'll see some attempt to identify what this most prior thing is. You'll see it logically too, right? What is in mathematics might be axioms, right? And so there's the constant push of what are the axioms on which everything rests, and are we assuming axioms that maybe shouldn't be assumed? Let me do that. Give me a second. We can do like this. I'm trying to do this in a way that doesn't end up cutting off things vertically, but that should be better. How's that look? Hello. Awesome. Cool. So again, if you weren't here before, this is a paper that this is a draft version of a paper that Lawrence Calhoun, the philosopher Lawrence Calhoun, gave at the Metaphysical Society of America conference in the beginning of 2025, right? So a little over a year ago. So he might have a newer version of this out somewhere in the wild, but this is just the version that I have, and I thought it was fun to go through. Anyway, thanks for the feedback. I appreciate it. Have you read Hosek Chang? I have not read Hosek Chang, but I will write that down and take a look at it. Let's see. H-A-S-O-K. Oh, I can type. Sorry. H-A-S-O-K. Oh, cool. I now have, I've got this thing up. After the stream, I'll go take a look at him. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Okay. Where were we? Right. Historically, philosophers have granted ontological priority to many kinds of items: a creator, eternal forms, or the one. So, primary substances or their types, secondary substances, material elements and atoms, a mind or minds, or dualism of mental and physical substances. Traditional philosophy has made priority honorific a reference to a higher type of being, more real and more valuable. Today, among those willing to tackle general metaphysics, many are physicalists for whom human mental phenomena are either unreal or epiphenomenal effects of physical events. So, if you're a real hardcore physicalist, right, then the only thing that's really real are kind of the most basic physical elements, which you can get down to quarks. And then you could talk about, matter fields and all this stuff. And so I think that starts falling apart a little bit, or they'll say what can be described explicitly in terms of physics as the natural science physics. That's the only thing that's real, and everything else is just kind of details on top. I think that's a wrong way of approaching it. Are particles real if there are excitations of different quantum fields? Yeah, right. So when you start digging into things like quantum mechanics, I think the nature of what's real just kind of shifts a little, to my mind. And so there's just a different way that you have to approach the causality and and physicality and these kinds of things that come from, honestly, at its heart, again, comes down to wave mechanics, because wave mechanics are freaking weird and complicated and do crazy things. And so I keep harping on this. The reason why quantum mechanics is weird is because it's wave mechanics. And you get a lot of this same weirdness in other sorts of wave mechanics. But yeah, so you start having to reframe Um, yeah, right. So you have to reframe what these ideas of reality are. And we just had a discussion earlier in terms of, because he was talking, kind of connecting reality to causality in some way. And when you start doing that in general relativity, you identify these causal connections by light cones, and the ordering of those can shift and can change dependent on how things are moving with respect to each other. And so what is first, even ordering of events can be different for different observers depending on what's going on. And so I think, there's probably a larger project that I'm sure people have engaged in terms of trying to reframe what this basic concept is of how you can possibly identify reality, and what does that mean in these terms. I You end up with these really weird questions, right? And I think part of it rests, if I were to give my 2 cents on it, I think there is a structural element to it, right? There's an Aristotelian formal cause piece that's playing a part in here that is often it's come into play a lot more in the philosophy of emergence theory, but you see it a little less in when physicists discuss it, right? But the idea of transition between or the emergence of something as real kind of depends on a formal interconnection of things in my mind. I don't have it all sketched out to by any means, but yes, events which are time-like have absolute orderings, but events which are space-like do not. And what makes the distinction between time-like and space-like to different observers depends on the relative motion. Obviously, there are things that are kind of absolutely space-like curves to all observers, but that's like faster than the speed of light stuff, right? There's question, right? That's almost a way that you can have an absolute distinction of existence versus non-existence. Maybe. Right, there's questions. Can you have things like tachyons that are theoretical particles that are kind of mirrored in that they only go faster than the speed of light and can never go slower? What happens if you go through a black hole, white hole kind of thing, and you start crossing those event horizon world lines and stuff? That's a wonderful question. What is physical, right? I don't necessarily have an answer for this, right? I'm saying I think there is a very interesting project to put a lot of this together that a lot of people are obviously engaging on. But you'd have to go through, you'd have to know a lot of the physics in each of these fields. You'd have to dive pretty deeply into each of these fields to be able to connect these physical concepts towards a philosophical concept of reality, basic concept of reality, connected to physicality and or what is potential actuality, all these sorts of things. And so what would be interesting to do would be to try crossing all of these different subject areas within physics, trying to identify that concept of reality or objectivity and see if these things align, right? So if you approach, are you actually approaching something that's within the Venn diagram of all these things that you can then cross identify, right? I think another great one would be statistical mechanics and thermal physics, right? Because you start dealing with ideas of potential and emergent quantities. This is why some people have time as emerging from statistical mechanics with the direction of entropy, that kind of thing. But I wonder if you would actually condense on something that's shared amongst all of them. And I don't know, but that'd be an interesting thing to do. That I'm sure someone's has done in the past or is currently trying to do. And these things all shift as we make new discoveries within these different areas of physics as well. I think if you ever argue that only wave function is real, QS will say it's wrong. Yeah, right. Science is metaphysically neutral. We have different philosophical interpretations of the same physics they're doing. So I would argue that science is not metaphysically neutral. I would argue that science is making very specific metaphysical. The fact that we're asking questions about what is conceptually real is a philosophical question that's being brought up by the ways in which we engage with the physicality of the universe, right? And so as we try and pick apart that the nature of physicality in all of these different areas, are we coalescing around some single idea of what being itself, what existence itself means? Or are these things really divorced from each other? And what would that mean about the universe if the concept of reality that's being identified by each of these subjects is divorced from each other? That's a wonderful question. So that's, I think the philosophical piece to it is very important, right? Because it approaches and discusses things in a very different way than the physicist approaches these things. But if you're going to approach this metaphysical discussion in a sensible way, you'd better know what's going on within the physics, right? I firmly believe that you have to have at least a somewhat clear idea of what's going on. Or what's going to happen is you end up pontificating about some idea of reality that comes from common experience, but may not, but is really just a very small subcategory of reality, right? So in the way that we don't in our everyday life encounter time dilation all that much, and so that's why it took so long for relativity theory to come about, because we don't experience it in our everyday life. We only got to relativity theory through the back door of electrodynamics. So, yeah. Anyway, so continuing with this paper. Okay. There is no standard term for the fourth meaning of real. Some try to exhaust it by combining existence and substance, or phenomena or events, or even primary experience. All are too narrow. The term beings might be applicable if granted maximum scope. One might better say that this notion of the real applies to anything whatsoever that is discriminable, capable of being encountered, experienced, thought, felt, or imagined in any way, which does not mean it is produced by discrimination. So in other words, anything that it has the possibility of being in any way discriminated. It would include anything actual or non-actual, anything objective or subjective, anything prior or dependent, be they entities, facts, events, processes, properties, universals, particulars, agents, experiences, ideas, meanings, possibilities, or past, right? So, the concept of unreality is itself real, right? This is why Hegel had, the beginning of Hegel's logic is so difficult to parse, because he's trying to talk about completely abstracted being, and when you do that, you you run into something that's nothing. You know, it ends up in this almost contradictory way in which these concepts fall into each other. But right, so this is one way that you could talk about real. Right, so he's talking about he's going through the different ways people talk about reality. One way you could talk about, you know, the kind of most ambiguous way of talking about reality is talking about it in terms of anything you could potentially even identify or separate or think about, right? Those are necessarily real in some way. American philosophers came the closest to articulating this. In his Radical Empiricism, William James claimed the distinction of between being mental and being material was not substantial, but relational and functional. Sorry, let me reread that. William James claimed that the distinction between being mental and being material was not substantial, but relational and functional. That's very interesting. So in other words, there's nothing... I don't know enough James, but as through this statement here, he's saying that the distinction between an idea and a physical thing is not the fact that one is physical and one's aphysical, I guess is what he's saying. This was later called neutral monism. The idea appeared as well in Ernest Mach and Bertrand Russell. A chair is something capable of functioning in two different sets of relations or processes: a material interaction when I sit on it, and my perception and or cognition of the chair. This was taken up by American New Realists like E.B. Holt, Morris Cohn, expanded it into neutral pluralism. He called anything whatsoever, entity, event, property, or whatever mental or physical or mathematical, a, quote, complex in relations. As Cohen put it, the question should not be, is something real, but how is it real? In what context of relations does it function? For Cohen, real cannot be an honorific term. Nothing is ontologically prior. Each is as real as the next. Right. So in the very fact that it's there as something that can be identified, it's just as real as anything else. So there's no way to talk about something as more real or foundationally real. So atoms are not more real than molecules, right? They're all real in the same sense. And they're real in the same sense that an idea is real. Right? All of these things are kind of on a level. Okay. This was claimed by John Herman Randall, Ernest Nagel, Justus Buchler, at Columbia University, and by one non-Columbian, Charles Morris, as part of what they called objective realism. Go down. Thank you. All right. For example, we regard railroad tracks as really parallel, but they appear convergent when standing on them and looking the distance along the tracks. For all these thinkers, the convergence is not an unreal appearance. The tracks really are parallel and really convergent. Parallel in relation to the train that rides them, convergent in relation to our binocular vision when standing on them. The tracks are objectively relative, functioning in different contexts with distinct but related properties in each. So in other words, you couldn't get objective realism. Oh, did I say that wrong? So I just don't know what you're referring to with that. Right. So what he's saying is, yeah, there is nothing that's more real about the tracks being parallel than there is about the tracks being convergent, right? we understand the convergence as a trick of how our brains interpret the visual information. But just because that's true, that doesn't make it less real, right? We can reproduce that same trick anytime we wanted. There's something real about that trick, right? And the way in which we process that information. So what's important is not saying something's real or not real, but what's important is saying it's real in some specific way when it's being connected to some other thing, right? It's real that convergence trick has reality when it comes to someone standing on the track, right? And it's that interrelation between the person on the track and the train tracks themselves that gives the reality to it. It's also real that it's parallel in a measured sense, but that's a different relation, right? So it's real and they're both real, but they're real in different senses. So what that means is reality then gets reconditioned to every set of interrelations, is what I'm guessing based on that. Okay. Indeed, they must. Cohen pointed out, or else the rules of visual perspective would be wrong. The real identity of the track includes multiple coherent integrities in different contexts, right? They wouldn't be parallel if they didn't impact us in such a way that our brains would see it as convergent. No mistake is made as long as we keep the context straight. Buchler produced the most complete version of this view, calling its basic principle ontological parity. So that is what I think the author here is trying to put forward, right? That on this concept of ontological parity, which is kind of reality in terms of these relations, is really what it is. It's a relational kind of theory. So that's what he wants to say is important. Anyway, the domain of discriminable complexes categorized by ontological parity does have restrictions. So again, he's talking about complexes because they are things that can have a lot of different relations, right? So they can be real in a lot of different ways to a lot of different subjects. So it's this sort of yarn ball of different possible relations. Right? A round square, anything self-contradictory, which we cannot coherently conceive, is excluded. So in other words, things that are definitionally impossible, like a round square, or which inherently contradicts itself. Maximally collective terms like the whole, all, and everything are excluded as indiscriminable without any definite properties. So this is like, again, like Hegel's being, right? Hegel's pure being, which is so all-encompassing that it's nothing. Right? It has no characteristics, because any characteristic would reduce it down to a being. It would be restrictive in some way, and being in general, being by itself is not in any way discriminated. It's not distinctive. It doesn't have any identifiable separate concepts, because that would restrict what that being itself means, right? But in doing so, it's the heat death of the universe thing, right? Everything is nothing. Everything is it's completely isomorphic in all directions. And so nothing is discriminable, nothing is determinate in any sort of way. So So that's why he has to exclude the all or everything or those concepts from being these sorts of interrelational balls that he's saying that make up the ontological parity concept. Likewise, simples are excluded from being incapable of further analysis or contextual variety. Ontological parity avoids anything first or final. This is a Columbian's inheritance from Charles Peirce's fallibilism. I don't know what that is off the top of my head because I'm not a philosopher, so I apologize. We may summarize the four reals. Ontological parity is close to what philosophers mean when they say beings, if widely applied. Actuality is somewhat comparable to presence or existence if these have discriminable opposites. Objectivity is whatever is invariant across sets or perspectives, agents, or minds. So objectivity is a thing that you can agree upon from multiple perspectives. Ontological priority is granted to whatever is uniquely independent. For many philosophers, it virtually defines metaphysics and inherits the scope of classical and religious traditions for an honorific real. Okay. The problem with ontological parity. Oh, wow. We've been going for an hour and a half. How do you like that? Anyway. How long is this? I seem to remember it not being that long, but we might end up splitting this depending on how long this takes. All right. Let's see. Okay. Sorry. Clicking on random things. There we go. Okay, the problem with ontological parity. While I, him, the author, would not claim it is wrong per se, ontological parity raises certain problems. They revolve around the status of the unreal. Ontological priority must declare a subset of whatever is discriminable real and another domain or set unreal. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to read better. The problem with ontological priority, not parity, right? Ontological parity is what he wants to talk about. Ontological priority is what he's saying has some issues that ontological parity could potentially fix. There are two options in understanding the unreal. The unreal could be literally nothing, or non-being, or perhaps illusion, if that is regarded as equivalent, or it could be epiphenomenal domain, incapable of making a causal difference in reality. So that's what epiphenomenal. Something's epiphenomenal if it, kind of rides along the top of something but doesn't impact. So, this is the old version of emergence theory or concepts of mind, right? Where the mind doesn't, a thought doesn't impact the physical. It was assumed. This is not true. Of course, the physical and thought are deeply entwined. But this was the old idea, right? That this, so if it's epiphenomenal, it means it cannot have some downward causation, right? So it's the idea that although a thought can cause another thought, that line of thinking doesn't cause physical change or doesn't have physical causal capability in the same way that a ball rolling down a hill does. That is foundationally untrue, but that just as an explanation for what that means, right? Various philosophers have resigned almost anything to the unreal, from changing sensory appearances to matter, to properties or universals, to minds or meanings. The present King of France, Mignon's Golden Mountain, and Sherlock Holmes, right? People say all of these things are unreal, which is interesting because this parallels all the categories that people were saying are real. Now, if unreal were literally nothing, nothing could be said about it. Therefore, it need not and cannot be accounted for at all. Some claim this more this about mere appearances or illusions. This would imply that the real utterly transcends the unreal, right? Is in some way beyond the unreal. Such was held by some classical and religiously inspired metaphysics. Many in the past century have had this in mind when they regarded, quote, metaphysics as the study of a transcendent reality and hence rejected its possibility. To this day, many anti-metaphysicians take this as the sole notion of metaphysics, which is tiresome. So again, that's not what metaphysics is about. Right? Metaphysics is not an unreal discussion of an unreality. Hey, Sis! Good to see you. We are in the midst of a philosophy paper that has direct ties to physics and these kinds of things. So we're trying to talk about reality and unreality in these terms. Right. If, on the other hand, oh, by the way, yeah, Rania, hey, thank you for showing up here. It's so good to see you here. Yeah, so we're going through a philosophy paper. We're trying to break apart what are the concepts of the real and the unreal. And it's a very difficult thing to break apart. Oh, no. Okay. Turbo recap. Let's see. How shall we turbo recap this? So what we're trying to ask is, how do we build the concept of reality is kind of what we're getting at. What do I mean by that? How do we determine something as real or unreal? And how do we characterize it, right? How do we... Let me go back to sort of his introduction here. And I'm just going to reread this. I'm sorry for those who have been here for a little bit. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to think of the best way to do this quickly. Okay. So there are many the many usages of the term real and reality cannot be correlated here, nor can we entangle. Okay. Philosophers have identified all sorts of things as the real, forms, God, materiality, mind, experience, the whole, the one, etc. They commonly differ from the reality of topics like time, universals, possibilities, and numbers. That's not really helpful when it comes to an overall... Okay. So he's trying to talk about ways in which things are said to be real, right? So there's a lot of ways in which, for example, people can talk about, are ideas real? In what sense are ideas... Do ideas have the reality of a chair, right? Or to go back to the discussion that I had originally, if I talk about a desk, right? And I talk about the subjective versus the objective in terms of a desk. So as a subject, I as a subject can encounter a desk, my desk, and have certain experiences about it. That experience could be the sensation of color, of touch, right? I can feel its exterior. I can have a sense of how big it is, its space in the room. And I can also have a sense of, it can give me memories of the time that I've used it. Maybe it was sitting in my parents' house for a long period of time, right? And so it can bring back memories of my parents' house, of experiences that I've had. If my parent were to come and see the desk, they would have a completely different set of memories that are tied to it, even if they have the same experience of it as a white desk that's missing some paint, that's made of wood, that's sitting here, that takes up this amount of space, right? So if I want to pick apart those into what I'm trying to talk about, what is it that there's the thing about the desk that impacts the both of us in a way that we can agree upon as objective, as external from each of us individually, even though yeah, Quine tried to get into this quite a bit. I haven't read a lot of Quine directly, but yes, he did talk about this quite a bit. Yeah, so we're not going to go directly into the Schrodinger equation, but we sort of discussed about it. Only path integrals. Yeah, the path integral stream is going to come, gonna show up later. So we discussed a little bit about this earlier in terms of quantum mechanics, right? Where you start encountering things that are in some ways beyond the direct possibility of experience, right? You never directly experience the wave function in itself. What does that mean to talk about the wave function in some way? What is the sense of reality of a particle that itself is just a mode in a vibrational field, matter field, right? What does that mean in terms of a desk? It's a very different concept of what real is, right? Which is also very different from the concept of what real means in a black hole, or to a black hole, trying to understand how things can be simultaneous or not simultaneous to different observers within general relativity, depending on how you're moving. So trying to approach these sense of what real is from all of these different directions is a very interesting and open question, right? And so this is something that philosophers have been tackling for millennia, right? Philosophers have been approaching this kind of question, and in our more modern time, the natural sciences have started to approach these same sorts of questions and to bring in different sorts of answers in different ways. So a great example of this, right? Let's talk about the reality of temperature. What is temperature, right? You walk outside and you feel something and you understand that it's cold outside or it's hot outside. If you break down temperature, it is the average kinetic energy of the particles making up the gas that you're feeling, right? But each individual particle doesn't have a temperature. Temperature is a property that exists in a bulk material, right? You can't have temperature of an individual atom. You have temperatures of a bunch of atoms that are in a group, right? This is statistical mechanics. What are these statistical properties? There's a sense in which that temperature is real, right? You don't want to say the temperature isn't real. Now, some people have said, right, well, temperature isn't really real. Temperature is fake. Right? What's really real is the average kinetic energy of the particles. That's sort of more real than the temperature is. But you can cook a steak with it, right? So in other words, you can't I agree. They're not the same, and that's the point, right? They're different. Not only are they different in a sense of experience, but they're different in the sense in which they're real. Sort of. Right? And so this is where emergence really fits well into this. So emergence says you can have categorically different things or different properties at different levels of complexity, right? So even though the concept of temperature doesn't make sense in terms of an individual atom, right? You can have something that's real called temperature that exists when you have a group of atoms together, right? And it only makes sense in terms of a group of atoms. And we we deal with things in terms of these large groups of like 10 to 20 something atoms at a time. And so temperature makes sense to us as this sort of thing that we can experience because we can't experience the kinetic energy of an individual atom, right? But it's a categorical difference, but that in itself that is real, but it's real in a different way, right? And so that's the question. How do you identify what reality itself is if reality is shifting as you go across different scales, different physical scales? So that's that's part of the question that they're trying to get at with some of these discussions, right? And so so this is a paper that was given because temperature is an average quantity. Temperature is just so when you have an individual atom moving at a single kinetic energy, that's just the kinetic energy of that atom. But temperature is a measure of multiple atoms having a kinetic energy together, right? So it's only by having a bunch of atoms together that you can have something that's measurable as temperature, right? In the same way, you can't have how should I say this? You can't have something called a protein that's just an atom, right? A protein and the properties of a protein exist on a complexity and on a physical level that's different than the individual atoms that make up the protein, right? The atoms act in an entirely different way than the protein acts, right? But that doesn't make the protein less real, but the properties of the protein are very different than the properties of the atom. There's something that's happened there that's given a categorical shift in what it can do, what the protein can be, that the atom can't be, and vice versa, right? So, and having that idea breaks apart what, you have to be when you start talking about a broader concept like what's real, you realize you have to approach it from a lot of different ways, and you have to be much more contextual about how you're talking about what reality is. And so the other example that he gives is, let's say you're standing on a set of railroad tracks. So are the railroad tracks parallel? Yes. But if you look down the railroad tracks, they converge, right? It's this optical illusion of the convergence of the railroad tracks down to a point. Is that less real than the parallelness of the railroad tracks? It only exists because of the properties of those tracks being, the length they are, the distance they are, the having the degree of separation, the constant degree of separation that they do at each individual point. But to you standing on the tracks and looking down the tracks, they converge in a perspective geometry, exactly. And so the idea that he's going towards this, which is the what's the term? Ontological parity, right? The term that he's using, that Lawrence Calhoun is using in his paper, ontological parity, is saying that both of those things are real, but it only makes sense in relational terms, right? So it's only right. No, not priority, parity, right? This is the distinction. Ontological parity is talking in terms of this ball of interrelations. Ontological priority says, no, what's most real is the fact that you have these tracks that are parallel to each other. Metaphysical dependence is the ontological priority piece, right? My understanding, and I will say I am not a philosopher, so I could entirely be misunderstanding, but my reading of what he's saying, and please tell me if I'm wrong, if you understand it differently, my understanding of what he's saying, based on as we've read through this, is that there is, if you're going to identify reality in some way, you have to include these relational aspects, right? So something is real as converging in perspective because it's this relation between you as having binocular vision that operates in a certain way and the tracks that are parallel in a certain sense, right? But the parallelness is also true in relation to a train going down the track, right? That's what he's trying to say. That's his thesis on ontological parity. Ontological priority is saying that something is more real, and then you stack it like so what's most real is what's at the bottom of your stack, and then you put additional realities on top of it that are dependent on that most real thing. So it'd be like saying, well, the atoms are the most real thing, and then the molecules are less real because really what's there are the atoms or the quarks or the matter fields or whatever you want to get down to, right? That's the most real thing. And then these other things are kind of lesser reflections of the thing that's most real, right? That would be ontological priority, is this sort of stratified version of it. And what he's saying is not that ontological priority is wrong or that ontological parity is the only thing that there is, but he's trying to say, hey, you have to also use this concept of parity, this relational concept of ontological parity in your discussions of metaphysics if you want to be doing good metaphysics. Right? That's what he's trying to say. All right. If, on the other hand, the unreal is something, okay, so now we're asking the opposite question to what's real, which is what's unreal? How do we identify something as unreal, right? And this is a very interesting question to think about, because if you've identified something as unreal, you've in some sense given a reality to it, right? So you can talk about dragons. Are dragons unreal? Well, in a certain sense, yes, right? You're not going to go out and find a dragon, but they have a reality in that you can identify what they are. You can distinguish what a dragon is from what a beholder is in Dungeons and Dragons, right? If you're playing a game of D&D. Neither of them are real in a certain sense, but they have a foundational reality in another sense. So now you have to ask the question, all right, how do you identify something as not being real? Or how do you identify what is unreal? Is everything just real? But what does that mean if everything is real? Because part of the way that you identify something as real is the distinguishability that we were talking about, right? So something's only a dragon because you can distinguish it as a dragon from being a beholder, right? The fact that you can tell one from the other gives identity to the thing itself. So if you're saying everything is real, because by saying something is unreal, then you've given it reality, then reality itself is unreal because you can't separate it out. This is the big question with unreality. How do you identify unreality? Again, yes, right. Always messing with language and experience. But they're trying to get to when they do it right. Now, sometimes, absolutely, philosophers will build castles in the sky, right? And this is one of the dangers of philosophical projects in metaphysics, especially. This is why I don't like Platonic type philosophies and things like that, right? I'm a physics guy by training. You have to go back to, you can't, to my mind, it's very easy to build logically consistent and completely invalid logical structures, right? So you can build a logical structure that's supposed to explain reality that is completely divorced from it, even though it's internally consistent, there's nothing contradictory in it. So yeah, so it's trying to get back at something else. So you can talk about definitionally, right? So there's a whole group of philosophers that tries to associate everything with linguistics, and they're going off the rails in my mind. Yeah, it's easy to construct, but you have to do this interplay back and forth. And if you're doing physics, that's what you're constantly doing anyway, right? You're constantly going on this interplay between going back to some sort of empirical connection and trying to be very careful about the assumptions that you're imparting to the outcome of these experiments and what that actually means for something. And that's why I really like when dealing with physicists or scientists in general, they will be very, very, very careful about what if they're doing their job right. Right, there are always some who will go off the deep end, but they'll often be very, very careful about what they say is true and real, right? Even about the things that they're studying, and they will be very careful with their language about the things they have about what knowledge, about their connection between knowledge and reality, right? They'll talk about things in terms of levels of confidence of understanding, and these sorts of things. So going back to this, right? Definitions are language in terms of language, right? And so ideally, we'd like to separate reality from language, because we want to say reality or language is a way in which we engage with some sort of reality. Right. Ideally, our language does engage with some sort of reality, or we're talking nonsense. But at the same time, we don't want to just push reality around through our definitions. So when it comes to talking about existence, to what is real, what encompasses reality, in some way we want a reality that does include dragons, right? Because we want to say that we can identify what a dragon would be with enough. There's a great YouTuber, oh God, what's his name? The Thought Emporium, right? And he did an extended discussion of the biological changes you'd have to make a fire-breathing dragon. So he's a genetic engineer by trade, right? So he does genetic engineering of a lot of different things. Great YouTube channel, The Thought Emporium. Absolutely advise watching it. He has amazing videos. But he talks about, hey, look, we can make all of these changes and have a fire-breathing dragon. So in some sense, there's a potential for dragons to exist that, say, beholders can't, because beholders are explicitly magical in that sense. But there are versions of dragons, at least, that are in some way have more potentiality than other versions, right? This isn't necessarily a talking dragon that casts spells, but you could have a fire-breathing dragon that he talks about, right, in some way. That kind of would fit all the categories of a dragon. So there is some sense of potential that could have more reality than a beholder, which is an inherently magical thing, which goes back to our concept of, all right, now we're talking about the reality of something which isn't real, and how something that isn't real is more real than something else that isn't real. Right? These are the complexities of trying to identify what we mean by reality. But if we're not talking about reality, when we talk about the world, what are we talking about? So it's important to have some understanding of the limits of what we mean when we apply the concepts of reality. If we're going to talk about, especially something like physics, where we're encountering a reality that is inherently outside of the bound of human experience. That's what's really cool about physics, that physics can do, is you can talk coherently and effectively about the reality of things that are outside the possibility of human experience, because we can connect the effects of those things that are outside the bounds of human experience to things that are inside the bounds. So there's a reality to those pieces that's different. But how is that potentiality, right? So the thing that we talk about, like when we talk about the wave function of a particle, which, by the way, is a mathematical construct, right? You only get the actual particle itself when because it's the probability density. It's not even the actual probability of the particle, right? You have to do psi star psi. It's not useless though, right? Because if I'm going to go through a project of genetically engineering fire-breathing dragons, then that concept is very important, right? It guides the way in which you make genetic changes to an animal to get fire-breathing dragons. So it's not just useless, because those it'd be useless in the same way that Maxwell's equations are useless. Maxwell's equations, the mathematics that we use to describe reality very effectively, right? You don't find a flying del cross E floating around, right? They describe reality, but they also describe possibilities, right? Because they describe the way I can, in advance, describe the way in which an electromagnetic wave is going to propagate through an antenna that doesn't exist yet, right? They describe possibilities we can see, but the whole point of that other video was that it's possible to genetically engineer a fire-breathing dragon, right? So again, you start talking about possibilities. So in some way, some possibilities have more validity than other sorts of possibilities, right? So the possibility of this antenna that hasn't been built yet, but I can design, right? I can think through how the electromagnetic energy will propagate through this antenna, right? Has a sense of reality that's more there than the dragons, right? Because people have built antennas, even if they haven't built this specific antennas, a specific type of antenna. You can say, well, people have built antennas, but there are lizards. See, when you start having to stratify all these things, it gets very difficult, because you end up very quickly building those sorts of metaphysical castles that we were railing about before, that you have to be very careful about, of what's more real and what's less real when none of the things are actually there. Right? So this is why this is why I think philosophy is important, even if we do physics, and I think you can't just throw philosophy out. To my mind, philosophy is very important. Yeah, so it's, don't believe in modal realism. That's fair. Yeah, but there are metaphysical consequences of believing or not believing in something like modal realism, right? Something is possible. I agree. I agree. It's not possible something this thing exists. But in a certain sense, the language and thought gives it a reality that's different from something that hasn't been thought, right? You can even say there's a reality in the neural structure of the inherent in the language of describing this thing. And not only that, but the fact that some possibilities are possible to be instantiated, right? And these possibilities guide the way in which we describe reality as well. All I'm trying to say, I don't have a. Let me take a step back. I don't have a specific definition of reality that I'm trying to push, or that I would say I have well fleshed out, right? What I'm trying to say in this discussion is that it's a complicated question, and I think there's a lot of there's a lot of different ways to approach it, right? And so this paper is approaching it in a one specific way. That's highlighting how different people have approached the basic concepts of reality, right? And so some people throw out, that kind of like how you were saying that things that are. Some people throw out the idea of potentiality altogether, right? They say there's nothing really potential. The only thing that's there is what's actually there, what's really there, right? And everything else is just not there. But yeah, there's a lot of ways to, yeah, right. That's so. Yeah. For example, what does potentiality mean within quantum mechanics? Right. That's another. You can start applying it that way. What does potentiality mean in a statistical sense? Which is really what's happening in quantum mechanics, right? Because a wave function is mapping out a potentiality, really. I don't know. It's weird. I'm not saying I have an answer to this. I'm just pontificating. That's weird. Anyway. Thank you so much for this discussion, by the way. I love this. Thank you. This is a lot of fun. And if you're interested in more philosophical things, I haven't really lent into the philosophical conversations much, but I will lean in more if there's something you're interested in. Let's see. I mean, that whole discussion about what is real is useless, actually, because it presupposes that language, in some sense, represents reality, but that's wrong. It's a tool for constructing a definition, so it's useful in practice. In a certain sense, yes, I agree with you in that we cannot define language purely linguistically, right? You end up with translation, right? You can just look at the fact that there are translational errors. The very idea that there are translational errors means that language is a vague approximation of reality, right? And I would argue the same thing is true for mathematics. When you're doing physics, because what's useful about it is that there is possibility that is independent of what actually exists now, if that makes sense, right? You have to have, I believe you have to have some concept of potentiality or possibility to accurately describe in any way the reality that we engage with, right? Because otherwise you end up in a sort of static state. So whether that potentiality is a potential energy, right? Which is a very interesting crossover that I'm not going to get into, but potential energy, the potential of a concept, you can say the possibility of dragons to be real is real, not the same proposition that dragons are real. Yes. I agree with you. I'm not saying that dragons are. I'm not saying that those realities are identical. I agree with you 100%. Yes. The question is, in what way what is the reality of possibility? And how does that intersect with the reality of things that we say are actual, right? We want to make a distinction there, obviously. We don't want to say they're real in the same sense. They're real in different senses, but there is some way in which they're real. What is that? That's a squirrely question. I don't necessarily know the answer to that, but I think that's as opposed to we want to say that they're real as opposed to something that's outside the bounds of the possibility of thought or existence or something, right? So what's unreal is I guess would be the question. How do you make how do you understand unreal? I don't know. In some ways possibility is, or in some ways potentiality is unreal. That it's not actual. There's not a real dragon sitting outside my window. But the truth value presupposes some version of reality to which you're connected, right? Because truth is connecting something to a statement, right? You're talking the validity of something to something else. It's a relational connection. That's what validity is relational inherently. What are the things you're relating? Now, some people say that the relation itself is the basic thing. I don't know Quine's answer to this. Again, I haven't read Quine. Maybe you could tell me. Well, what is Quine's answer to this? It's a good question. I was writing those practices that are useful in science, right? Yeah. There are certain things are more useful within certain kind of spheres of inquiry or things like that, right? Things are useful in artistic expression might be different, right? So the reality of something, I don't know. Quine would say that only those things are real which can be quantified by our best scientific theories is pure pragmatism. Okay. Right. So yes and no. Because okay, so here's the question. The mechanism by which we quantify, right? The language by which we quantify, which is mathematics, right? Numbers. What sense of reality do those have? in some sense, they have to have a more, if we're going to say that we define things as real by their ability to be quantified, then something about you almost end up in a Platonic sense of numbers. Okay, yeah. So Quino's a Platonist, right? Numbers are most foundational. He was nominalist. And what? Again, all right, I'm gonna have to read Quine to get a better understanding of how he would approach this. But I appreciate that you know Quine so well. That's awesome. Quine Putnam. Okay. That is on another tab after Hasak Chang. So now I have Quine Putnam Indispense. Yeah. Cool. That's next on my reading list. I appreciate it. This is why I like talking to people who know more about things than I do. Because I'm like, oh, cool. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I know Quine's approach to some about his approach to science and some of that stuff, but I know him kind of by association rather than having read his stuff independently. Yeah, I'll take a look at it. My dad would know better. He actually is a philosopher by trade, but anyway, well, this has certainly got us off on a rabbit hole, which is awesome. I'm so glad. Like, I'm not saying that facetiously. I really mean it. I'm so glad to have this discussion. This is amazing. However, it does mean that I think I'm going to cut this. I think I'm going to cut this reading short. So what we'll do is I'll keep this with the markings here. And then next, so I'm going to bring up the schedule again here. So let me do DS, and was it DS? Nope, not that. Hello? Yes, it was this. Okay. So I'm going to bring up the schedule again. So this is today, the Sunday morning paper that we're kind of going through here. So what we'll do is next week we'll continue from where we stopped. We'll go back a little bit and then we'll just continue on with this paper. If you come back, I would really appreciate it because I love having your background here. If you don't, no worries at all, but it's really cool, again, having someone who has experience and has understanding and background coming in to help me, because I really appreciate that. So if you're interested, please come back again next week. Tuesday is going to be our reading of the Hobbit Chapter 4. Yeah, sure, absolutely. Feel free to send me any papers you think that we should do after this one. 100%. I'll take that one down and we'll put it in the plan. It took me a while to figure out what paper we were going to do today because I went back and forth between some, I was like, should we do a general relativity question or should we do something like that? If you can either hop into the Discord or I'll just Google that paper name. Operational coherence, and I'll find it, and then you can let me know if that's the right paper. Yeah, so what we'll do is the next Sunday morning paper, awesome. I'll put that on. So once we finish this paper, we'll go on to that one. So I do want to finish this paper, and then we'll go to that paper. We'll put that on the rotation. The next one on Tuesdays are typically Thursday evenings, because in the evening my brain's fried. It's going to be either reading aloud, so it's in the middle of reading aloud The Hobbit, so we're going to go chapter 4 of The Hobbit, or I'll be playing a game like War Thunder or something. Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern is going to be I'm going to change that to 10:30. I'll put this up, but I'm going to change it to 10:30, so it's the same time as Sunday. It's going to be a research stream, so I'll see if I can get my hands on it. I got me some connections. I'll see if I can get my hands on it. So the research stream is going to be a long-term research project that's going to be very mathematics heavy. Doing stuff with time frequency functions and representations and path integrals. I need to learn how to do path integrals. I have a fairly good grasp of the time frequency and the Cohen function side of it. I don't have a good grasp of path integrals, so you're going to get to watch me stumbling through learning path integrals and then trying to apply it in some interesting ways. So those are going to be the research streams. So those will be every Thursday. Yeah, if you have any background or experience with this, let me know a good place to start, because I've got some documents, and I have a feeling I'm just going to, most of the stream is going to be me sitting there being like, which will make a very interesting stream. But anyway, so we will be doing those on Thursdays. And so as of right now, this is the schedule. Again, I will change the Thursday stream to 10:30 just so it's even across Thursday and Sunday. Tuesday at 5:30 Eastern is going to be our non-math philosophy streams. And yeah, I may hop on every so often to play some games, but these are the scheduled streams that I'm going to do my best to stick to. Actually, this Thursday I'll keep it to 11 because I've already posted this image someplace in someone's Discord server. So I will keep to this for this week. Next week I will change it to Thursday being 10:30, so it's even with Sunday. I'm also going to fix the indentation on Sunday that's bothering me so much. Anyway, at any rate, thank you so much for everyone who's joined me. I really do appreciate it. I haven't ever really done a raid on someone before, because usually I honestly stream to myself. So, let's see if I can figure this out. Who is around? Let's see. So I'm gonna go browse. Science. Let's. Oh no. No. Is there really no one doing science and technology? Oh yeah. Here, let's see. What do we have going on in science and technology? We've got NASA. We can raid into the NASA stream. They've got the Artemis going on. Ooh. Someone's doing theoretical physics and rock/metal. Anyone interested in that? I've never heard of this person before, but let's try raiding into them. I've never done a raid before, so I think it's just !raid, right? I think that's how you do it. Anyone who has streamed before knows. I think it's raid. Universe Momentum. I do not know who this creator is. but they are doing theoretical physics and playing rock music. So, and they have a little label that says "drink more water." So, that didn't work. Okay. Whispers, roars, predictions. Does anyone know how to do this? I haven't ever done a raid before. Other channels you might for? No. All right, I'm gonna do the worst thing ever, the most boomerist thing ever, and I'm gonna Google how to raid. Okay, how to raid and Twitch. I'm literally the worst streamer in the history of the platform. It's great. How to use raids. Twitch, please tell me. It's slash raid, not exclamation raid. Slash raid. There we go. Universe momentum. Okay, well, I have no idea if this is going to work. I don't know if it's going to work immediately or if it's going to do a countdown timer. This is what experimentation is for, but one way or the other, enjoy some theoretical physics and some rock and roll music. Huzzah! Have a good one. Bye!